It gives me a great pleasure to welcome our guests here tonight for this session on the Latin American left, opportunities, challenges, and setbacks. And there really couldn't be a more timely moment to do this with this election of the right populist Javier Milei in Argentina. Really quite an earth-shattering thing that reflects, I think, trends far beyond Latin America, the tenor of our times, as it were. And so there couldn't be a better moment to look at the future of the left in Latin America in the face of such an event. So I'm going to be very brief with introductions, so I could talk for a long time about each of our speakers, but because we have a panel of three, and because we want to get on to our Q&A with all of you, I'm going to be extremely brief. So first of all, I'm so happy to welcome Professor Karine Pereira. She is a professor at the Center for Sustainable Development at the University of Brasília. She's visiting here at the moment in the ID department, so we're taking advantage of her presence. Her recent articles include the construction of state capacities and infrastructure policies, socio-environmental demands and state heterogeneities, and radical reorganization of environmental policy, contemporary evidence from Brazil. She has a whole list of publications, but those two anyway I wanted to mention. She'll be speaking in her initial contribution tonight on opportunities and setbacks faced by the Brazilian left in implementing environmental policies. She'll focus on the period since Lula's election. Secondly, we're lucky to have Melany Cruz. Melany is lecturer in international politics at the Global South at Leicester University. She has a current research project on nonviolent resistance in the Chilean feminist movement, and that explores the resurgence of the feminist movement in Chile. For those of you who want to have a look, she has an article just out this month, or a co-authored article, I think, A Revolt Within a Revolt, Feminist Political Ideas in Chile's Social Uprising, in the Feminist Review. So that couldn't be more opposite for tonight's topic. She'll be speaking about the rise of the recent feminist movement in Chile and its impact on progressive politics. And last but not least, I'm welcoming back Dr. Geoff Goodwin. He's a lecturer in global political economy of Leeds and co-director of the Center for Global Development. I was saying he only left here 5 minutes ago. He used to teach in our department, and he's already co-directing the center. His research centers on land and water in Ecuador, and more recently in Colombia. And he has a wider interest in the history and political economy of Latin America. Geoff, by the way, is an expert in Karl Polanyi, and will be coming out, I think, with a book sometime soon on Polanyi's relevance within development. He'll be speaking on Ecuador, discussing Correísmo and the prospects for an emergence of a wider and alternative left movement in Ecuador. So we want to welcome you all. We'll exit the stage, and I want to call Anna, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me well? So first of all, I'd like to thank Professor James and Professor Laura for the invitation. For me, it's a big satisfaction to be here with you all this afternoon. So as James said, in this afternoon, my goal is to discuss a little bit about the opportunities, the challenges, and the setbacks of the Brazilian left in implementing environmental policies, and especially to protect the Amazon, policies to protect the Brazilian Amazon. So to begin with, I would like to talk a little bit about the Brazilian left, specifically about my focus on the Brazilian left. So right now in Brazil, there are about 30 political parties formally registered in the electoral court. And can see in this picture, most of them, they're located on the right. And on the parties that are located on the left, they are quite diverse. And there is a very predominance dominance of the working party in the left in terms of electoral success. So because of that, my presentation here will be focused on the working party, what we call in Brazil, Partido dos Trabalhadores, you probably have heard about it, or PT. So another interesting question to begin with is this one, is the left popular in Brazil? And as you can see with this graph, the majority of the Brazilian electorate has a greater identification with the right over time, and this has been reflected on the presidential elections. So all those pictures are pictures of the Brazilian presidents who were elected since 1985, which is the year when Brazil became a democracy again. And only two of them, they can be considered to be left-wing politicians, which is Lula, you probably have heard about him, and Dilma Rousseff. Both of them, they belong to the Working Party. So Lula, he was the president of Brazil from 2003 up to 2010, and right now he has just been elected for his third term, so he's our current president, as you may know. And Dilma, she was the president of Brazil from 2011 up to 2016 when she was impeached. So pretty much I'm gonna be focused on, I will focus on his day administrations. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about what happened during the Working Party's administration from 2003 up to 2016. In terms of environmental policies and policies to protect the Brazilian Amazon. So when Lula took office in 2003, the environmental situation was quite bad actually, especially because there was a very high increase in environmental deforestation. As you can see in this map here, like in 2003, the situation in terms of deforestation in the Amazon was really bad. So one of his main goals was to curb deforestation in the Amazon. So the new government, they started to do all these, to take all these measures to curb deforestation in the Amazon. And one of these measures was to strengthen the environmental bureaucracy. So Lula, he nominated Marina Silva, who is this very renowned environmentalist, and the whole world was celebrating that she was chosen to be the Minister of the Environment. And Marina, she was able to select all these very professionalized top-level bureaucrats to work with her. Most of them, they had a lot of experience with forest management, so that was really helpful to create that plan, the action plan to prevent and control deforestation in the Amazon. And besides that, the government, they also invested a lot to consolidate a state career of environmental analysts, which was very important to implement environmental policies by that time as well. So in terms of policies, the government created this action plan to prevent and control deforestation in the Amazon, which was very successful to create conservation units, to strengthen inspection actions, and as a result of all these actions, there was a very impressive deforestation decrease, as you can see in this map here, from 2005 up to 2012. So this decrease accumulated like a reduction of about 80%. This actually represented the largest single contribution of a country in curbing to curb climate change. So it was very impressive. Besides these achievements, the Working Party government also faced a lot of many challenges during this administration from 2003 up to 2016. So one of these challenges was the change of the governmental agenda. So in Lula's second term, there was a very big focus on development in the developmental agenda, which was represented by this growth acceleration program. So with this program, the government basically, they wanted to boost economic growth through investment in these massive and very large infrastructure projects. And in the Amazon specifically, the government invested in the construction of hydroelectric dams such as Belo Monte, probably you have heard about it. Actually, this picture represents tries to capture the consequences of Belo Monte in the fishing communities. And also they invested a lot in paving roads in the Amazon. And all of that caused a lot of social and environmental consequences, such as the reduction of conservation units, which has been created like in the first years of Lula's government. Another challenge which we have been facing since then in Brazil was the strength of the, what do you call it in Brazil? I don't know if that's the right word in English, what do you call it? Ruralistic bloc in Congress. So this bloc, they're pretty much linked to agribusiness interests, and they defend environmental flexibility and also the flexibility of environmental policies and regulations. And specifically during the Dilma Rousseff's government, they were very successful in organizing themselves to be represented in the Congress. And also they started to contest the environmental achievements from Lula's first government. So there was this very contentious thing going on in the Brazilian politics around agribusiness and environmental interests. And as a consequence of that, the Congress approved the new Forest Code in 2012, and that represented a huge setback in terms of protecting Brazilian forests by that time. So as you know, Lula has just been elected again last year in 2022, and the situation when he took office again was really bad in terms of environmental issues. So the previous government was very successful in dismantling our environmental policy, and during Bolsonaro's government, the deforestation in Amazon, it raised like over 60%, so the situation was really bad. That means that when Lula was elected, many environmentalists inside and outside Brazil, everyone was celebrating. But what I want to discuss now is like, what does really mean Lula's elections for the environment right now? So is the environmental agenda in his government strong or not? And does the government has the tools and the capabilities to really implement a strong environmental policy? So before talking about Lula, I just think that it's important to talk a little bit, very briefly, about the legacy of the previous government, Bolsonaro's government. And so Bolsonaro, he was the Brazilian president, as you probably know, from 2019 until last year, 2022. And he was elected by these political party coalitions, which was pretty much linked to agribusiness. And most of his voters were also linked to agribusiness, especially in the Amazon region. So once he was elected, he started immediately to really try to dismantle the environmental policy in so many ways. So he ended this policy that I've just mentioned, the act program to control deforestation in the Amazon. He also suspended the Amazon Fund, and he nominated for the Minister of Environment, Ricardo Salles, which pretty much is pretty much linked to agribusiness interests. And he was actually involved with illegal timber export, so it was really, really complicated. Here, I'm just gonna summarize this data here. Here, I brought some data about research that I have conducted, specifically about the environmental inspection policy. So here, I've just tried to understand how the government was able to dismantle this specific policy. So basically, Bolsonaro, he reduced the budget for inspection actions, and the government also approved all these normative acts to undermine the street level bureaucracy in the field, the autonomy of the street level bureaucracy in the field. And also they started to nominate all these directors who this top-level bureaucracy who were military and they had no experience with the environment, and most of them were like involved with environmental crime. So it was really a dark moment in Brazil. So going back to Lula again, during Lula's election campaign last year, the environmental agenda was very strong and very central in his speech. So in his inauguration speech, he even stressed that the new government must rebuild the environmental policy and should also reposition Brazil as a global leader in the fight against climate change. And he nominated again Marina Silva to be the Minister of the Environment, which again was very celebrated by the environmentalists. So by that time, Lula environmental agenda was very ambitious. So he claimed that he would do everything so that Brazil could achieve zero deforestation by 2030. He would strengthen IBAMA, which is the regulatory environmental agency. He would create new conservation units. He would also transform the environmental policy in a transversal policy so that many ministers, and not only the Minister of the Environment, would be involved with this in the policy. He would also restore the environmental budget and and other goals. So what has been done so far in these first months of Lula's government? So he was able to reestablish the Amazon Fund, which is very important to sponsor the environmental policy, the implementation of the environmental policy. He also increased, the government also increased the budget of the Ministry of the Environment, and they also they were able to revoke many decrees from Bolsonaro, decrees that harm the environment, such as this decree that created this program for the small-scale mining in the Amazon. And they created, again, the action plan to prevent and control deforestation in the Amazon. So with this plan, they intend to create new conservation units and to hire environmental analysts to implement the policy. So what are the main challenges that the new government has been facing to implement this environmental agenda? So one main challenge in Brazil is the political polarization. So which this map, I think it shows very well this polarization. Lula, he was elected by a very small margin over Bolsonaro. It was like really small. And actually this map shows this polarization. The states who are in red voted in the majority for Lula, and the states which are in blue voted for Bolsonaro. So the country was really, and it still is, very polarized. And another problem was the election of the state governors. So most of them, they are linked to Bolsonaro's. So there is a lot of opposition in the state level to Lula. Also, since the country was so polarized, the Working Party, in order to win the elections, they had to build this really broad political party coalition, which included 16 political parties. So it's really broad. And some of these political parties, they are also linked to agribusiness, so they are not very open to strong environmental policies. Another challenge was the election of the National Congress. So right now in the Brazilian Congress, congressmen are discussing some really important bills in terms of environmental issues. So for instance, there is this bill about environmental license. The intent of this bill is to make the environmental license more flexible. And also this bill that makes the approval of pesticides more flexible as well. The problem is that the composition of the Congress that we have elected last year is pretty much linked to Bolsonaro. So the opposition linked to Bolsonaro has the majority in Congress right now. So the situation for the Working Party is not like the best one. And there was also a significant increase of this anti-environmental bench in the Chamber of Deputies, and also a strength of the parliamentary agribusiness front in Congress. So the situation is not really good right now for environmental issues. And because of that, we have already experienced in Brazil some setbacks in this first year of Lula's third government. So the first setback was the approval of this law in the Congress, which withdraw many important responsibilities from the Ministry of the Environment, such as responsibilities related to water resource, basic sanitation, and solid waste. And another setback is the own working party agenda, which is also very, what is the word in English, like developmentalistic. So the working party, they're defending this new growth acceleration program. Oh, I'm thinking. They are defending the launch of this new growth acceleration program. So with that, they want to invest again in this massive infrastructure project in Amazon, which is, it can cause several social environmental impacts. And also the Working Party and Lula himself is defending the oil exploration in Amazon, which has already been contested by IBAMA. But there is a lot of pressure in IBAMA right now from the government to approve this project, and we don't really know what's going to happen. So that's all for now. Thank you for your attention.
Hi everybody, can you hear me well? Yes, great, thank you. I'm just gonna grab some water because I've been giving 2 hours of lecture today, so I'm those kind of people when they speak in public, they need to be drinking water, you know? It's like a type of people, that's me. Thank you very much for the invitation today. So I have 20 minutes to run you through perhaps the enter of Chile into progressive politics in the scheme of Latin American region. Just as an anecdote joke, our Latin American neighbors don't really think much of us in terms of progressive politics. And here, I guess my colleague could corroborate that. For the longest time, and perhaps since the 1970s, when we had those sort of like large movements of progressive politics, or left-wing politics more in particular, Chile was obviously part of that. But after 70 years of dictatorship, and pretty much another 20 years of sort of centrist politics, Chile was regarded as like, and they say this joke in Latin America, the British of South America. You will take that as you will. But in the last few years, we've seen the transformation of national politics in Chile. So what I'm going to talk about today, and run hopefully in 20 minutes, to talk about the sort of background, contextual situation since 2019 with the social uprising or popular uprising, seeing a little bit of the cause and the consequences of that. I'm just going to run through that very quickly because the focus I wanna center on today is to talk about the recent feminist movement and its role during the social uprising, and speak about my own research and what I found out when I discussed this issue with feminists, one particular feminist organization in the country. And finally, just I can see the typo now in this, gonna bother me, but anyway, the challenges and the setbacks on the influence of feminist movement in Chile today. So, in October 2019, we see what in Chile we call La Revuelta, which was a social uprising that emerged particularly from the rise of metro fares in Santiago, the capital. This happened on a regular weekday in the commutes, in which a group of students, not university students, but school students, start like a random protest in the metro by jumping the metro barriers. This was not particularly unusual. We have a pretty strong student movement in Chile, so this was kind of a regular day. Except that October, the majority of the population started joining these social protests. We see randomly on TV how instead of people criticizing students and saying the same thing again, oh, why students are protesting? Oh my God, my commute back home is getting double the time. They were actually supporting them. They were like, oh yeah, this is the end. We have to all join. We all have to support the students. We have to join in. We have to join in. And from that, we see a spiral of a series of protests, violent and non-violent protests that lasted for a few months. So what is the background? Why suddenly we have this sort of uprising, this sudden outspurt of anger and discontent? In the analysis of the 2019 sort of crisis, we can say that there was a high discontent for the cost of living crisis, hence the rise of metro fares, and a discontent in traditional political system. At the time, the president of the country was a right-wing politician called Sebastián Piñera, and people were very discontent, not just of the economic consequences, but also the high level of corruptions that it will kind of popping up every now and then in different financial sector, political sector, and so on and so forth. And one of the topics that emerged from this period of sort of social movement is that we see a clear critique from social organizations that start joining this continuation of protests is a critique of the continuities of the 1980s Constitution. I said at the beginning we were on a dictatorship for 17 years, and one of the consequences of that dictatorship was the writing of the 1980s Constitution. It's a very, very tight constitution. What I mean by this is that it's really, really hard to reform. It's very hard to change, and although it's been reformed throughout the 90s and 2000s in democratic governments, these reforms have not been enough to actually transform, make a structural transformation for the country. And I think there was an underlying argument or narrative emerging from these movements to say, well, this is the time to change the constitution. This is what is going to solve the main structural problems in the country. So we see this discontent happening. And what was the reaction of the mainstream political system? All political parties from the far left to the, well, there was not a clear far right yet, but to the proper mainstream right. We see there was not a clear response to this social uprising. In fact, I believe, and this is perhaps we could argue that it was actually they were quite surprised. They could not believe that for the first time in decades, the Chilean population was actually revolting against the political system. It was so harsh, the response from the government, that this is a direct quote from the president at the time, "We are at war with a powerful enemy." He said that in front of cameras and live television, so that sort of made things worse, and it kind of created a second round of high level of protests in the country. This obviously was response with high police force, military forces were in the street, and it was a lot of violent confrontations at the time. And of course it brought serious consequences and serious violations of human rights. Unfamously, over 300 eye injuries were identified during this period, alongside other very serious violations of human rights. What happened after the the period of the social uprising. As I was saying, one of the answers that the social movements, the civil society, and then the political system thought it would be a good outcome was to reopen, or just open, because it's never been open before, open the constitutional process. That is still ongoing. That meant, and I can expand on this question if you're interested later in the Q&A, because it's a kind of a side conversation, I guess. But the constitutional process meant to write a new constitution that will replace the 1980s constitution. This was a pretty important outcome because it was decided through a referendum at the end of 2021. Yes, a referendum by around 80% voted to actually create a constitutional convention that will write a new constitution. This was done throughout 2001. We see the creation of the convention by the election, 100% elected members. And they write the draft, and by the end of that process, the draft is rejected in another referendum. There's a lot of referendums in this story, so if you can't keep up, then we come back to it, okay? Because there's a lot of referendums happening. So that draft is rejected. The interesting part of that dilemma for the discussion we're having today, which has to do with the progressive politics and in Chile in this case, is that those who were elected to the convention in 2021 were majority progressive forces from left-wing political parties, but also from independent social movements. So the draft, one could argue, was very, very progressive. We're talking about lines of what happened in Ecuador, for example, plurinational state, legalized abortion, access to radical things like a national health system. This created quite, of course, a lot of discontent from right-wing sectors of the country. Nevertheless, at the same time, we were having a national election to elect a new president. And in this context emerged, it was not a new figure because Gabriel Boric was a member of parliament, but he became the running lead candidate for the progressive forces at the time. And he was elected in our second round against Felipe Cast, who was the far-right candidate of, and one of the founders of the new far-right party, it's called the Republican Party. I don't know where they got that idea from. It's very, I don't know, it's very original. That's the two forces that got into the second round, and Boric is elected in 2021. What is interesting about this process, and I think I want to highlight this because it kind of tied nicely to the second part of the presentation, is that 68% of women under 30 supported Boric. And we see an increase in women's turnout to vote. The highest turnout of women in democratic elections since the 1990s, so since we returned to democracy. So we're seeing that there's a high political movement from women's organizations, but also what I'm going to talk about today, the rise of the feminist movement. The feminist movement, of course, or the feminist trajectory in Chile is much longer than 2019, as it is in most countries. But I want to highlight the milestones since then and how influential this particular movement has been for the push to progressive politics in the country throughout the social uprising and in the aftermath. And I want to highlight one particular organization, not because it is a mainstream organization, but because it's an organization that saw a different strategy to implement or to incorporate feminist ideas into mainstream politics. And this is Coordinadora 8M. They organized the International Women's Day in 2018, and they created this coordinadora, which is basically a network that it works autonomous from political organizations, either political parties, NGOs, or trade unions. In 2018, they were quite present and they took quite leadership in what it was called Mayo Feminista, which was the Feminist May. A particular set of protests that happened that May against sexist education in higher universities. These were because there was a lot of cases of sexual assault in universities, but also a lot of discrimination against women students and staff. So university students, once again, they came out and sort of organized occupations and protests. But it was the first time in the student movement history that there was a leadership and from women, and the connotation of that movement was feminist. So it was called the Feminist May, in reference obviously to May 1968, as you probably will make that parallel. Another important milestone that put this network of feminists at the front was the organization of the Women's Strike, which takes place on International Women's Day in 2019. So before the social uprising, which has been one of the largest protests since the return to democracy, which is also very impressive to be a feminist movement that kind of gathered that amount of people in a march. And then we have a more international, well-known milestone of this movement, that is the performance of Las Tesis that have performed here in London. I think they're quite well-known, but also I can just explain a little bit more what they did with that performance during the social uprising. It's identified that performance, because there was a decline in the everyday protests in Santiago, but it's measured that after that performance and the series of performances that they did with this particular dance and music, sort of like artistic intervention, there was a return to the social protest. So people kind of returned back to the street after the Las Tesis intervention. So we see how there's a series of milestones around the social uprising that have that sort of feminist intervention and connotation. Who are these feminists, right? So it's a bit of an abstract to think about the feminist movement. Who are they? In the public face activism, the majority are urban, university-educated, young women, so under 30. This is the vast majority of women that participate in the front of the feminist network, but also as spokespersons in during the social uprising and any of these other organized events, and that's kind of what you see. However, they also describe that they have a very intersectional approach to who join the network or the movement. We start seeing, and this is also an interesting phenomenon of how we identify these feminists or these feminisms, is that a lot of organizations, political parties in particular, but also trade unions and more traditional social movements, like movements for water, for example, they start building feminist branches within it. So we start seeing how mainstream politics, institutional politics, start using the language of feminism to explain their politics around 2018 and 2019. So we start seeing this interconnection between what I call institutional feminism and non-institutional feminism. And for the process of the social uprising, this was a very coherent alliance, if you want to, because allowed institutions, organizations, political parties that have the infrastructure to run events, protests, marches, and do lobbying in Congress, for example, build alliances with like street movements and social movements. I put here as a side point that what is the ideological position of these feminists? Because it's so diverse, it's very difficult to pinpoint what are the ideological alliances. And that's what it was my question when I started, so what are these, who are these feminists? Because yeah, from the media you start thinking where they are located, what are the networks, but what are they thinking? What are their ideas that they can contribute to this idea of progressive politics? And before knowing is that they were anti-capitalist and or anti-neoliberal and left-leaning. I'm gonna skip this and then we can talk about it more. But so what I found in my research is what feminist organizations, particularly Coordinadora Auto de Marzo, managed to implement or to expand feminist political ideas across the political spectrum using two elements. Horizontalidad, which is like horizontal politics, and autonomy, which was a way for them to intersect and enter to make several political spaces, but also maintain independence from militancy programs. So allow them to have that flexibility to step in and out of certain political situations that were not perhaps feminist in principle. And the second of it is the implementation of political narratives that they were expanded throughout society. One of them being the idea of precariousness of life. So they started interconnecting the problem of neoliberalism, so the crisis of neoliberalism that Chile was going through and kind of exploded in 2019 with a contribution from feminist ideas. Something that is not new, by the way. Those who probably studied feminism here will be like, well, that's not new. It wasn't new, but it wasn't new for these feminists either, but it was the ability to interconnect those problems in order to gather wide support across the population. And obviously invite more women in particular, but not just women, men, and other diversities into the feminist movement. And I have some quotes there, but I can come back to them if you have any questions. So I see the spelling as well again. The challenges we see here for the progressive movements from a feminist perspective, I think there are three at the moment. One of them is what I told you at the beginning, the rejection of the constitutional proposal, and the opening of a new constitutional process that is still ongoing. We have to vote on the 17th of December. That is being written now from the far right perspective, which is not very helpful. Feminists have not been able to intervene in that space again. They have a huge intervention in the previous process of drafting the constitution, and then now are kind of isolated from that process. So opens the question of how much of these ideas are still very present in the daily debates, political debates in the country. That goes in hand with the rise of the far right, which is in principle anti-feminist. We think about anti-abortion, anti-women's rights, and all those narratives that are not unusual. I believe you're probably familiar with as well. They have entered parliament with 2 senators and 12 deputies, and they constitute the 35% of the Constitutional Council that is currently just draft the new constitution proposal. And then is the re-articulation of all these feminisms. So we have the tension, as I was saying, institutional feminism and autonomous feminism. Since the election of Boric as a progressive president, we've seen the retraction of institutional feminists that obviously are working on the interests of government, but in tension with the continuation of autonomous feminist organizations that are in the street criticizing the progressive government. So the alliances that work in 2019, 2020 and 21 are not so clear anymore. So we haven't seen again that wider movement, street movement that we see in the last few years. So those are the tensions and the challenges the feminist movement have, that it shows success in the last few years, but has been more dormant or quiet in the last year or so. Just to finish, what is the question here is that obviously it's ongoing, we can't resolve these problems or predict these problems, but what is interesting is that entry to the political arena of feminism in Chile is been a unique opportunity. So the question is, was that the only opportunity they had, or there will be other avenues for them to continue to intervene in the political sphere? Right, so this is obviously a set of references, but thank you very much. If you have any questions, we talk about it.
Okay, yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Melany and Anna. That was really fascinating to learn about what's been happening in Brazil and Chile. I'm going to be focusing on Ecuador. First of all, I'd like to say a huge thank you to James and to Laura for the invitation to speak. It's a huge honour for me to be part of the Cutting Edge series. I've watched it for many years, and I know how much work goes into organising these events. I'm really honoured to be part of it. And on a personal level, it's also wonderful to be back at LSE, seeing colleagues and former students as well, which is excellent. Okay, so I'm going to focus on Ecuador, and I'm going to focus really on, I'm going to break my talk into three parts. I'm going to start by setting it up as some kind of paradox, what I'm calling a neoliberal paradox. That is, how do we understand the election victories of neoliberal candidates in Ecuador in 6 years after the leftist president Rafael Correa left office in 2017? And I will argue in the second part that to understand that, we need to look at the nature and also the legacies of Correísmo, the movement that has emerged around Rafael Correa. And then to finish, I'll really focus on some of the opportunities for a left, the wider left in Ecuador, in the context, in the wake of Daniel Noboa's election victory in October, just last month. So, Ecuador witnessed some of the most sustained and widespread resistance to neoliberal reform and structural adjustment from the 1980s, early 1980s through to the early 2000s. And if you want the backdrop on that, you might want to read Duncan's earlier work, which was really shows some of the sort of social devastation really it was caused through structural adjustment and neoliberal reform in the 1980s and 1990s. And this really widespread mobilisations, which came across different sectors, really created the platform for Rafael Correa to win the 2006 presidential elections, and he started his presidency in early 2007, and he remained in power for 10 years. And here, Correa is reflecting on this moment in Ecuadorian history, this sort of landmark moment really in Ecuadorian history, in an interview which was published in the New Left Review some years after the election victory. So he says, what we were proposing was a revolution, understood as a radical and rapid change in the existing structures of Ecuadorian society in order to change the bourgeois state into a truly popular one. Yeah? So, in my opinion, Correa fell well short of achieving this. However, his government's made significant advances as well. State institutions were rebuilt after decades of decline during structural adjustment and neoliberal reform. There was significant investment in infrastructure and public services. Social security and social protection expanded. There are also some quite novel social inclusion programs that his government experimented with, including with working with street gangs, for example, even if the prison population also increased significantly. Public parks, public spaces were revitalized. So more broadly, I think what Correa did, and to some extent he embodied this, I mean, this is him as a much younger man, he really generated a sense of progress and hope in Ecuador, especially during his the early years in office. And these advances and his charisma explain why he was able to win 2 consecutive presidential elections. I mean, he won 3 presidential elections consecutively, but 2 are based on full terms in office in the first round, which is really unprecedented in Ecuadorian history. So he was an incredible electoral force, and this explains to some extent why he continues to have considerable support in Ecuador. Okay, so what happened next then when Correa left office? Well, Lenín Moreno, who was a vice president under Correa, he took office and he won the 2017 elections with a mandate to continue Correa's political project. But he quickly abandoned that and embraced what I would call neoliberal austerity under the guidance of the IMF. So he signed 2 massive agreements with the IMF, totaling to $6.5 billion, and this included lots of the usual conditions we would associate with the IMF, so austerity, cutting back public spending, privatization, and economic liberalization. And then Guillermo Lasso, who won the 2021 elections, and he beat the Correísta candidate Andrés Arauz in the second round. He then continued along this neoliberal path before being pushed out of office earlier this year when he was threatened with impeachment, and he dissolved the assembly and triggered new elections. So critics of neoliberalism or neoliberal policies, like me, expected things to get worse. You know, the expectation was that socio-economic conditions would deteriorate, especially for low-income groups and marginalised groups in society, but few people expected it to get as bad as it has done. You can see here from this data that come from CEPAL, a general deterioration in poverty. This reverses the decline in poverty that we saw during Correa's presidency, especially during the first half of his presidency. So you see this fairly steep increase in poverty. And today, around more than 1 in 4 Ecuadorians live on less than $88 a month. The minimum wage, I think, is currently $450 a month, the minimum wage. So conditions have become more precarious. Of course, Correa didn't eradicate poverty. Poverty was very much continued up during his presidency, but it's important to recognize that he made significant advances, and those advances have been reversed. The most alarming change has been in relation to crime and violence. The homicide rate here gives us a kind of general indication of a much wider tendency. So we can see here during Correa's presidency a quite significant decline in the homicide rate, pretty much, you know, soon after taking office, all the way through to 2017 when he left. And then when Moreno and Lasso come in, we see, certainly from 2020 onwards, really exponential increase in crime and violence. And these homicide rates are lower than other homicide rates. I'm just using them to give you a sense of the trend over time. This is largely connected to international criminal networks and gangs who are vying for control of very lucrative drug trafficking routes through Ecuador. Most of the coca is produced in the neighboring countries of Ecuador, in Colombia, in Peru, and in Bolivia. But Ecuador is a very important drug trafficking hub. So a lot of this violence and crime has been connected to drug trafficking, but it has been fueled, I would argue, by increased poverty, increased precarity, and by neoliberal austerity, by the restructuring of the state and all of those changes that we've seen over the last 5 years. So the homicide rate really gives us an indication of a much wider deterioration in crime and violence and security in Ecuador. On a personal level, it's been really distressing to see it deteriorate so dramatically. It's particularly intense in the coastal region of Ecuador, where the drug trafficking routes are more important, but it's spread across the country. And now in Ecuador, it's much more common for extortions, kidnappings, and political assassinations. Most famously, most disturbingly, Fernando Vicencio was assassinated. He was a presidential candidate. He was assassinated just before the first round of the presidential elections. We've also seen a series of shocking prison massacres in Ecuador, which have left over 400 prisoners dead since Correa left office. So we see this really disturbing deterioration in crime and violence, and really a state that's unable to control this process. What we've also seen as a consequence of this really is a massive outflow of Ecuadorians. So Ecuadorians started to pour out the country when the borders were reopened after the COVID pandemic. And this data, sorry, it's a bit complicated, but you get a sense of the overall trend. What we see here is during Correa's presidency, net outward migration was actually reversed temporarily, so more Ecuadorians were coming back into Ecuador than leaving the country for the first time in over 20 years. And then right towards the end, we see this sharp acceleration of migration after 2020, when the borders were opened out after during the COVID-19 pandemic. So migration is now at 20-year highs, and from what I can tell from this year, the numbers have continued to increase. So most Ecuadorian migrants who have been leaving Ecuador have attempted to cross into the US and Canada, often trying to travel overland through Central America. And this would involve crossing the Darien Gap, which is the gap, the tropical region between Colombia and Panama. And this comes from an El País article where one person who was crossing it said, look, I have more fear of living in Ecuador than I do of crossing the Darien. So we get a sense of just how precarious life has become in Ecuador, and it's really reflected in the migration data. So against this backdrop then, why is Correísmo, why is the Correísta party now called the Revolución Ciudadana, why have they not been able to recapture a presidency? 6 years after, we've seen this massive deterioration in socioeconomic conditions, accelerating crime and violence, and the Correísta candidate was defeated in the second round of the elections in 2021, and Luisa González, who was the Correísta candidate in the 2023 elections, the second round were in October, she was defeated by Daniel Noboa, who is a member of one of Ecuador's wealthiest families and comes from the right and is very much about maintaining some degree of neoliberal kind of continuity. So, you know, we could ask, but surely, given what we've seen in 2023, the time was ripe for a Correísta victory, but that didn't come to pass. And I think to understand that, we really need to look into the nature of Correísmo and think about some of its legacies. And I'll spend the next 5 minutes or so talking about those elements, and then I'll come on to talk a little bit about the wider Ecuadorian left. So Correísmo is just, of course, one element of a much broader movement. Okay, so first of all, then, I would like to focus on extractivism. You know, as is well known, the Correa government was heavily dependent on oil revenues in particular, but also on mining revenues, and his government tried to accelerate, or did accelerate, or expand the mining frontier, particularly in the Andean region. And this triggered significant local resistance, and it really ruptured relations with lots of the social movements, particularly the indigenous movement, the largest indigenous movement in Ecuador, CONAI. But also with environmental movements and collectives which have grown in strength in Ecuador over the last 20 years, and that's one of the really interesting developments that we've seen in Ecuador. And the Yasuni TT initiative, it was really emblematic of this. I'm not sure how many of you have heard of the Yasuni ETT initiative, but put very simply, the proposal was coming from an Ecuadorian perspective, we'll leave more than 850 million barrels of oil unexploited in the Amazonian rainforest, in oil fields located close and in the Yasuni National Park. The idea was that the oil would be left unexploited in exchange for compensation from the international community, broadly defined. And the Pereira government, who supported this initiative initially, were asking for $3.6 billion, which was estimated at around half of the value of the oil, given oil prices at that time. So it was an incredibly innovative initiative, one that was very much driven from below. The Pereira government certainly didn't start it, but the Pereira government supported it in its opening years. But when it didn't attract significant investment from overseas, and the Pereira government was starting to look for new sources of finance, it closed the initiative unilaterally in 2013, and then it blocked a referendum on the issue in the following year. So oil production started in the Yasuni National Park, or in the free oil fields with an integrated interest team, in 2016. So one reason I wanted to highlight Yasuni in particular was because it came back to haunt Pereira this year, when the movement behind the referendum in 2013 eventually were able to force a referendum on the initiative. Oh my goodness. Okay, so they forced a referendum on the issue, and the referendum won. It was supported by 60% of the electorate, and Luis Gonzalez really failed to support it, as did Pereira. Okay, I'm going to move very quickly through this. In fact, I'll just skip a couple of these points because they are as interesting perhaps, because this comes from my own research, but I can come back and answer some questions on this. One element of the Correísmo which is really important to understand, and this comes back very much connects to what Melany was talking about, feminism and was authoritarianism. So Pereira was, and Pereira's governments were authoritarian. They deployed significant amounts of repression and authoritarianism in various forms, and one of the most visible forms of this was during Pereira's weekly addresses. So he would often have weekly televised addresses or weekly radio addresses, where he would often single out people for particular attention. And in this case, he's referring to anti-mining activists in the southern Andes. And he says, I call on all the civilized citizens of the country, denounce these unpatriotic people, fight them. These are anti-mining activists. It's almost impossible to even talk about her, Lina Solano, who was one of the mining activists. Please, we have to send this lady to a psychiatrist. So you can see the kind of sexist language that Pereira used. And this is what Teresa Velázquez in her fantastic book refers to as a sort of performative machismo, which is very much part of Pereira's style. So this was very much about, this discursive technique was very much about trying to create the enemy, if you like, of a revolución ciudadana. And Pereira very much governed through a kind of populist logic of us versus them. And that really distanced his movement from the social bases and alienated lots of voters. So I think one of the big problems that Correísmo faces is the hero worshipping of Pereira. And this has really limited any space for debate, internal critique, or renewal within Correísmo, within the movement. And this very much came to play in the 2013 elections, 2023 elections, when Luisa González was very much presenting the Correa presidency as a blueprint for future Correa governments. You know, warts and all, take it or leave it. There was no kind of critique or self-reflection at all, at least externally and looking in. So, you know, my point really is, one argument I'd like to make when we think about the wider left then, is that there are limits, there are clear limits to what we can expect to happen within Correísmo, within the Correísta movement. And I think the recent election results suggest that Correísmo has hit its electoral limits. It captures about 33% of the vote in the first round at both the 21 and 2023 elections, but it won't be going anywhere either. It will remain a very powerful electoral force on the left. And I think the challenge then for the left is to find ways of working with Correísmo, but without being dominated and being consumed by it. So this would involve building a wider movement of left movements, autonomous movements, political movements and parties that are able to find areas of agreement while also respecting diversity and autonomy, which of course is a very complicated task. And I think CONAI, the largest indigenous movement in Ecuador, is really the best place to be able to do this. CONAI really led two massive mobilizations in Ecuador. It was interesting to hear Melany's reflections on Chile, because this was part of a much wider cycle of mobilization that we've seen in Latin America in 2019, and it was also a surprise in Ecuador, you know, that no one expected CONAI to mobilize its bases and occupy Quito in a way that it did in 2019, and then again in 2022. So two massive mobilizations which CONAI have led, and CONAI is able to articulate both indigenous or ethnic and religious, racial demands alongside class demands, and that's particularly true under the leadership of Leonidas Issa. So we can see this. We can perhaps come back to this and talk about it in the Q&A. But here are some of the demands that CONAI have made that they are expecting the Noboa government to follow through from, including introducing or implementing the Yasuni referendum. So I think just to conclude then, very quickly, I think one of the ways that this can happen, and I think this is where there's an opportunity for Correísmo, is to build from the ground up. I don't expect very much to happen in terms of the national leadership, but I think there are opportunities at a local level to build trust, to build relations. And this is Pavel Munoz, who's the mayor of Quito. And this is relating to the Choco Andino referendum, which was held at the same time as the Yasuni referendum, which is an anti-mining referendum. So I think there's opportunities for the Correísta Party to work with social movements and collectives at the local level and build some kind of left movement from the ground up, and I think that's the most promising route forward. So I'm sorry I took a bit more time, James, but thank you very much for listening.
As usual, the women are more disciplined than the men.
I know.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
All right. I think James is being ready to do Okay, this is, I think, a really rich set of presentations, giving us an awful lot to think about. And I know some of you are from the region as well, and may want to interrogate some of the positions that were put forward on the panel. So can I get a view of questions? Okay, where are our mics? Okay, we start here. We'll take 3 questions at a time to start with, I think.
Yeah, so I wanted to know, there's the talk about Ecuador. To what extent do you think that the increase in poverty, crime, and migration was also influenced by the end of the commodity boom led by China?
Okay. Did you have a question too, right next time? Okay, right here, maybe.
Hi. Thank you for your presentations. They were very interesting. It's very, I'm a Chilean, so it's very interesting to hear about the feminist movement from your perspective. And I wonder about, in general, probably for the panelists from Brazil and Ecuador, what do you feel about the feminist movements in those countries, and if you feel that the feminist agenda or the feminist the values behind or supporting, backing up the feminist movements could be an answer against the Gaudinismo. I don't know how to say that in English. In Latin America.
Thank you. And, okay.
Thank you. I think for me actually mostly would be what type of other idea would you actually try to implement for the left movement in Ecuador? Because the vast majority of the reason why Carisma is not popular is due to his linkages with corruption. For example, the essentially was a huge opponent of Pereira, and there are links actually that Pereira was part behind the assassination. At the same time, Pereira's government had plenty of links with the cartels and narcos in Ecuador throughout his whole tenure. There's a massive reason why the people of Ecuador have experienced actually violence and crime ever since he left. Even up to now, you have corruption in the fiscal and the judicial system as well, even money laundering too, offshore accounts, and it's all linked to Karine, and the reasons why it's also Belgium as of this moment. And even now with the centre right at the bar, you still have the Assembly of Ecuador, which is a majority made up of the PSC party, and at the same time RC5 within Ecuador. So in a current standpoint, it seems like it's something which is not going to go away, and the linkages to corruption are still prevalent, and they will be prevalent. So how is that something that the left can fix in the long term and not get caught up within that Coroni's movement?
Thank you. Why don't we start with those? Yes? Go ahead. Okay.
Thank you. Okay, yes, thank you very much for your, I'll start with it. Yeah, so that's a really interesting point. I think it's certainly connected, absolutely. I mean, the commodity boom, which didn't really end, which kind of, collapsed in 2013-14 in terms of oil prices, and that's one of the things I wanted to highlight in terms of, one of the weaknesses of Revolution Ciudadana or Correísmo was this heavy reliance on oil and mining revenues, and the lack of institutions that were created to try to smooth the flow of oil revenues. The money was just spent, and then Correa started to cut back public spending in 2015. So I think I certainly think that it can be connected to that. I mean, that heavy reliance on extractivism, on oil in particular. So this process of the cycles that we've seen in commodity markets, the inability, the faith of the Correa government in oil and extractivism to kind of fuel its political program. So I think you can certainly see that there were connections there, but I would argue that what we've seen in terms of public spending cuts and the reorganization, the restructuring of the state under, from Moreno and Lasso, I would argue is a more decisive factor, quite frankly. I mean, of course, we can agree to disagree there, but I think that it's certainly connected. But it's really the political choices that Moreno and Lasso have taken in collaboration with the IMF, I think, are really the most important. Shall I? I don't know.
Yeah, because there's another question for you, I think. Yeah. Corruption.
Yeah. So maybe I'll come back to the feminist movement at the end, so I don't talk too much. Yeah. So in terms of corruption, yeah, of course, the Correa government was very corrupt, like all of Ecuadorian governments before. I think one of the things that really struck me, having lived in Ecuador and having studied Ecuador's political economy, was the difference with Correa. Corruption is endemic in Ecuador, as it is in the UK, of course. It just happens in a very different form. It's legal in the UK. So I think the difference was Correa government was corrupt, but they also built things, but they also had, huge investment in infrastructure. The new airport was built, roads, so on and so forth. So I think there's huge levels of corruption, but the difference was what made the Pereira government different to the earlier governments, the right-wing governments. Well, they were corrupt, but they also built things. They also did things with that money. So I think the idea that any government, quite frankly, in any Latin American government is going to defeat corruption is just a fantasy, quite frankly. So I think all that you can do is try to think about ways of using public money in a more transparent way. But I think the anti-corruption fight is like the war against drugs. It's a war that can never end. So I think that absolutely, there's also you can make the same argument about the war on drugs, right? That the idea that any government is going to come in South America and sort of defeat the drug cartels is a fantasy. So they have to find ways of managing it. And I think to some extent Pereira was able to do that for a certain period of time. If you look at what happens in Bolivia as well, then you see a different way of trying to work with the drug trade and trying to institutionalize it in different ways. So I think, there's obviously a very strong tendency to put all of the blame on all of the problems we see in Ecuador and Pereira. I take a more balanced view. I'm very critical of Pereira, but I'm critical from the left. And I think that there are other factors we need to bring into play as well. Just to very quickly say on that, I think to some extent, what happened with Pereira also happened with Lula. Other left-wing governments were all wrapped up in the Odebrecht scandal, and of course, that's still playing out. So I think to some extent that was all about the pink tie and the fact that pink tie governments were investing more in infrastructure, and of course there's huge amounts of corruption happening. Yeah.
Anna, do you want to
I'll come back again.
come back after? Anna, do you want to? Because I think
Well, I
there was a
think the
question
only
about
question
feminism.
about Brazil was about the feminist agenda, right? Well, I have to say that I don't really study feminism in Brazil, but what I have seen is that there is a big mobilization around abortion. Right now, abortion in Brazil is illegal, but there are some exceptions. But because of the extreme right, they are trying to abolish these exceptions. So the feminist movement is trying to organize to avoid that. But I have to say that I don't really know much about it. So.
But one of the issues, I guess, is that these right-wing movements are very machismo. Machismo is very evident across the board, I think, and Bolsonaro especially kind of represented that. Did you want to add something?
Yeah,
No.
just to add beyond the case of Chile, I think the feminist movement in Latin America is quite on the rise in several countries. I think I'm not an expert on each of them, but my understanding is like in Ecuador, for example, you correct me if I'm wrong, there is a strong connection with PNADI, like indigenous women's, and they kind of like the decolonial feminism has emerged strongly as a political narrative. But yeah, across the board, I think abortion rights, campaigns against violence against women's campaigns are kind of the center of the rise of feminism. And I think in terms of their influence in social uprisings, the case of Colombia was also very telling. They went through a social uprising in 2020, 2021. It was around the same time as Ecuador. And women's had a lot of interesting role to play there. But yeah, I think Argentina and Chile had the biggest movements in terms of like interjecting mainstream political political systems. Yeah.
Just very quickly. I absolutely. I haven't studied the feminist movement in Ecuador. Maybe some people in the room have more insights than I do. But I think absolutely. There's a really interesting actually in the book that I mentioned by Teresa Velasquez. That's what really her focus is on how anti-mining activism was very much led by women activists at a local level, and how they were really responding to various forms of discrimination and sexism and inequalities. You saw with the quote that I gave from Pereira, the kind of abuse that they would receive, often very personal abuse. You saw the name of the person. this is in a televised address. So she really details that on a more local level, and so how it intersects. I think it's more of a kind of intersectionality, thinking about, you know, how feminism and race and ethnicity kind of intersect in class is really important. But it was important at the elections because Luisa Gonzalez is socially conservative. She's against abortion and other women's rights, and that to some extent cost her votes from the feminist voters and movements. Yeah.
Let me take another round of questions. One right here, and then we have one up on top.
Hi, thank you for your talks. They were all very interesting. I have a question for Anna regarding Brazil, and if you can speak a bit about the recent Supreme Court decision in September, where they voted against the agribusiness attempt to curb indigenous people's land rights, and how this connects with, I guess, protecting the environment and the role of indigenous people in doing so. And I know that Bolsonaro made a lot of reforms, which is why the Supreme Court decision was such a difficult one. Like, everybody was very scared that it was not going to have this result. And so, yeah, like whether Lula can also, maybe there's some possibility of Lula like reforming this, the Supreme Court, or I'm not sure. So to ensure that like not this kind of decision wouldn't like come back, essentially.
Thank you.
Hi, my question is not about one of the three countries that was presented on, but since we're talking about the Latin American left, I thought I'd ask it because it's very topical. I wanted to ask, how do you assess the future of Bernardo Arévalo in Guatemala, given that he's set to be inaugurated in January 2024, and he's now kind of facing a series of rather far-fetched allegations by the losing side, which kind of seem to block him from taking part. Thank you.
Thank you. First, I'll come to you next time.
Hello, thank you for your presentations. I have a question for Melany. You have talked about how successful, how the feminist movement in Chile has been able to mobilize civil society since 2018, but how do you assess that mobilization against the feminist movement, not in favor of it, and if there's like a trade-off between being more, I don't know, accomplishing goals in terms of political representation, of passing laws, and at the same time mobilizing the society and against that progressist agenda? That. Thank you.
Thanks. Next time. Go ahead. Maybe you want to take those three questions? Anna, why don't you start this time?
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you for your question. So you're talking about the map of Temporada, right? So I don't know if you know about it, but there was this big discussion in Brazil about this bill, which was being discussed in the Congress, but also in the Supreme Court. So basically, the idea, which was defined by the agribusiness, was that indigenous land could only be demarcated if these indigenous people were there in 1988 when there was the promulgation of the Brazilian Constitution. And that didn't really make sense because many of these indigenous people, they were expelled from their land, so that would have made that many indigenous people, they couldn't have had their lands demarcated. So it's very complicated and interesting because the Supreme Court voted for the indigenous rights, but the Senate voted against that. So we have this really contradiction thing right now. And I don't know how I mean, the Supreme Court is the Supreme Court. So I'm guessing that the indigenous, the demarcation will go on. But the problem is that the way that the Supreme Court approved this was actually like tricky somehow, because like if these lands are demarcated, then the state has to pay for the landlords that will have to leave the lands. So it means that you will compensate people who invaded indigenous lands. So many people in Brazil are criticizing this, and it is still very contentious. So I'm not sure what's gonna happen actually. So.
Right. About the question up there, I don't have a clear reflection yet. So let me think about it. I haven't thought about it, so I can't just come with a very good answer about that. But yeah, it's a really good question. Just haven't got my thoughts clear about that particular case as is ongoing. In terms of your question, thank you, very good question. What happened with the anti-feminist movement in Chile and how that sort of has affected the development of street politics alongside the influence that they can have in institutional politics through government, for example, elections. So the anti-feminist movement is very much reflected as in any other sort of Latin American government. We see sort of a moral stand against women's rights from the far-right party. So anti-abortion, obviously limitation of body autonomy in general, and also very little legislation or consideration against issues like violence against women, just to name a few. I think my argument is that what I think I sort of align with in this feminist movement is that they're doing what Forester's, which is a political theorist, talks about the politics of investment. And they do the politics of investment by combining two things, which I believe is a process of demand making that is sort of gaining inch of demands, for example, abortion first, and then a national care system second, but also by concept building, which I call concept building, which is advancing a political discourse in society. And I think, in a way, it's a success that there is so many anti-feminist narratives, because it's the opposition. When we're not having the conversation, we're not, in feminist terms, we're not winning. By having the conversation, there is a politic of investment. That is not about the ending goal, because this is not like forming a government, which will be the interest of all the progressive forces, like political parties, obviously. But it's about advancing that sort of discourse alongside the potential of changing things for better in feminist terms. So I think that kind of plays the success and failure of the feminist movement in relation to the anti-feminist sentiments that will continue to grow, obviously, because there is a polarization of society at the moment with the rise of the far right.
Yeah, I'm afraid I can't. Thank you so much for raising Guatemala. I'm afraid I can't really give you any informed opinion on what's happening in Guatemala either. It's, as you know, it's an incredibly complicated situation. What I would say is I think it draws attention, and I think we've seen this across the three presentations. It's a sort of a theme I think that connects all of the presentations is the strength of the right, the Latin American right, and that's quite fundamentally different to the context of the pink tide of the early 21st century, when the right-wing governments were widely discredited through structural adjustment and neoliberal reform, and when left governments were able to come in and really articulate a very clear vision of the future and a very clear path towards an alternative form of development, which of course took different shapes in different contexts. But I think that the strength of the right, and particularly the far right, is quite fundamentally different to what we saw 20 years ago. And of course that's a global trend. We see that in Europe, we've just seen it in Holland, we're seeing it across, in Vox. I think there's a lot of parallels between Spain and Vox, where the Spanish feminist movement in Spain is very strong, and you see a very virulent far-right reactionary response. So I think it just makes everything far more volatile, and far more dangerous, quite frankly, today. And I think the possibilities of dictatorships reappearing in Latin America are very real now, very real. You see presidents like Bolsonaro and Melany who openly celebrate dictatorships, winning significant portion of votes. So I think it speaks to a wider issue around democracy in Latin America and this perhaps global breakdown of liberal democracy, quite frankly. Not wanting to extend too much away from Guatemala because it has its own characteristics, but I do think that's a theme that is very powerful.
Thank you. Enzo.
Thank you. I wanted to ask Anna specifically whether you think that there is a missing economic dimension to Lula's new agenda on sustainability. Because when I compare his previous agenda in 2004, the first time he was elected, he also brought a lot of economic policies to the region that would provide electricity, banking, employment, support for the people who today and back then were committing deforestation, logging, poaching, all of that. And this time around, personally, I don't see that same motivation. I see big infrastructure investments, I see oil, I see all of that, but I don't see economic policies that provide alternatives to the people who have to resort to those illegal activities.
Good question. I'm going to go to my colleague Duncan here.
Just wanted to broaden out a bit Menzo's question, which I thought was really good, which is like, we've heard lots of politics, right? Sort of tensions between social movements and governments, especially when social movements get into power. Very difficult sort of tension. Then, Calvinismo, that tradition within Latin America, insecurity, rising issue for many people. Bukele is the most popular president in Latin America. El Salvador. What are the economics? So the left is always clear about what it's against and what it's for. That old saying, de propuesta propuesta. If it's not extractivism, then what? And it can't just be spend more. What's the productive economic element that the left is heading towards?
Good question. How about right back here? Okay, now everybody's raising their hands by now. Yeah.
Okay. So first question will be for you that you have started Ecuador, one of the few countries in the world that uses a foreign currency is Ecuador, which is the US dollar. So what do you think it's such a popular measure even today? And if you think and see this changing at some point, because even in the left, it's popular in the right and in the left side. And also you talk about the Jasmine Identity Initiative, which at the end was not successful. And now the current president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, is trying to do something similar, which is exchange of external debt for environmental protection. So that question is for Anna. What do you think about this measure? Do you think it can be successful? And what is the position in Brazil under Lula?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take a couple more because we're running out of time. I'd like the students to be able to raise their question.
Hi. Just really quick about the talk in Brazil. You showed a slide on the map of the voters for Bolsonaro and Lula, and I thought it was interesting how in the West, where in the state of Amazonas, Bolsonaro had more votes, which is interesting because of the anti-deforestation that Lula promotes. So I was wondering if you had an explanation as to why the state of Amazonas and all the West of the country, which is most rainforest, voted for Bolsonaro.
Okay, thank you. I have to let one colleague ask a question. I have to let Laura ask a question. Make sure you take notes. You can pick your favorite question.
Thank you, James, and thank you to the panelists. My question actually goes very much it's a question that's mainly for Anna, but a bit for Geoff as well. I wondered if, you know, the kind of electoral alliance for Lula seems to be pro-growth on the one hand, but then pro-environment on the other. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the kind of both the social basis in terms of voters, but maybe also the funding. And I'm wondering, you know, when we think of green growth and we think of green industrial policies, is this kind of a compatible, realistic vision, or are the kind of social bases and perhaps the funding basis from international actors not very complementary in that regard, whether international funders of the environment are not very pro-growth, and whether the funders of growth are not very green, and how that might be changing? Thanks.
Just a small question. Okay, I'm going to take one more question up on top of that. Over to you.
Hello. I would like to ask a question regarding, the new origins of Brazil and about to find new ways of finding economic growth, local growth, especially in rural communities in the Amazon, and how these new needs are going to cope with the necessity of conservation, mitigation, adaptation, especially with the key role that indigenous communities have in those areas. And what is the left going to do regarding that? Is there any agreement that they are willing to follow, or are they not actually paying that much attention to them?
Okay, we will turn to the panel.
Okay. There are so many interesting questions. I'm trying to answer to most of them, but maybe I won't be able to answer to all of them. So starting, what is the name again? Enzo, thank you for your question. It's quite interesting. Well, I don't really agree with what you said, because you mentioned that during Lula's first government, he was investing in this sustainable economy in the Amazon. But actually, if you look at PPCDAN, which was the major environmental policy for the Amazon, PPCDAN was supposed to invest in inspection actions and in the creation of protected areas in the Amazon, and also in the sustainable economy. So, which is very interesting to curb deforestation in the long term, because you have to give other economic options for local people to live. But actually, the evaluations of PPCDAN says that the program was especially successful in creating conservation units and also inspection actions, but it was not really successful to offer and to think about new sustainable economic ways, local economic ways. So I think there are some small advances, like both of ages. So the government would pay, what is the name in English? Anyway, it would compensate local families who work with sustainable activities, but it was not a big thing. And right now, the model for the Amazon, by then, it was just let's build these huge infrastructure projects like highways, roads, and hydroelectric dams. And I think right now the model is quite the same. I don't think there is a big discussion about how to develop a sustainable local economy in the Amazon right now. There is this discussion, but it's not very strong. Basically, the government is still investing in inspection policies and trying to create conservation units. And one of the reasons is because when I interview these bureaucrats, they don't really know how to do that. It's really easy to understand how you do inspection actions and how you create conservation units, but how you it's much more tricky and complicated and complex to really create a new model of a sustainable economy for local people. So I don't see many progress in that area either. So another question, someone asked about how come, I think it's really interesting when we see, sorry?
Go ahead.
Okay. I think when I show that map, I think it's very interesting and intriguing when we see that most of the Amazonian states, they voted for Bolsonaro, and actually Bolsonaro is really strong in the states of Amazonia. And the reason for that is because the agribusiness is really strong there right now. So the new frontier of pasture and agribusiness right now in Brazil is in the north of the country where the Amazon is. So when you see who voted for Bolsonaro in the Amazon, it's major this agribusiness. And usually, actually, there is this study that show that the municipalities who voted the most for Bolsonaro are the municipalities where the deforestation is the highest. So there is, because for them it's really interesting because they want to deforest. And if Bolsonaro say that he's going to flexibilize and weak inspection policies and all this kind of stuff for this kind of voters, it's really interesting. So, well, I guess that's all for now. I'll give some.
Melany?
There was a general question about production. So maybe
thank you so much. So just very quickly on dollarization, absolutely, dollarization is a huge issue in Ecuador. Ecuador, the economy was dollarized in 2000 very quickly under the guidance of the IMF once again after a financial crisis in 1998 and 1999. And if you look back at the charts on migration, you'll notice the first wave of Ecuadorian migration happened after dollarization. It was devastating at the time for most people. And there was a massive outward migration, and that was connected to global issues as well. So I think dollarization generally as a kind of monetary policy is like a straitjacket in terms of sort of development. Ceding control of the monetary policy to the Federal Reserve, basically losing control of any kind of influence over the exchange rate. So I think it does bring, and it has brought in Ecuador price stability, but that's come at a real cost in terms of, let's say, thinking about industrial policy or trying to bring about any kind of structural transformation. I think Pereira toyed with the idea of abandoning it in his early years in office, and I think he could have because he was so popular. But then he didn't do that, and I think Ecuador stuck with it. It's of course popularized through the press. The press always write very, very favorably around dollarization and how it's wonderful at keeping prices down. But I think in terms of a macro economy, it's a disaster. It's like a straitjacket for a country in the global south. And of course now Argentina is talking about following the same policy. And then that really links to Duncan's question and Laura's question as well. I think it's absolutely, the challenge is enormous, isn't it? Quite frankly, I've taught on James's brilliant development course here, and we look at the history of development in Latin America, and we see efforts at industrialization in the 1950s and 1960s, and how they hit their limits generally, and then the reverse, and so on and so forth. We can see in the case of Brazil most clearly, but also in Chile as well. The power of the elite, the class power, blocking any kind of reforms. Agro-industry in particular is hugely influential in Ecuador. So I think one of the interesting things, trying to think about it on a more positive note, is think about Latin America as a really inspirational place for innovation and creativity. And we see a lot of that actually in terms of economic policy broadly defined. In Ecuador, the Constitution, the 2008 Constitution enshrined, reorientates development around Buen Vivir. So it kind of looks at a totally different, at least discursively, and opens up space for actually rethinking development altogether. So I think it's not surprising that many post-development thinkers like Alberto Acosta, come from Ecuador, come from Latin America, have a different vision of development, which isn't necessarily based on industrialization, structural transformation. It's about something perhaps a bit more profound. So I think in Ecuador there's a very small but expanding agroecology movement. What was interesting about the Yasuni initiative was that the argument was, of course, if we vote to, and just to clarify, it was successful, so it was backed in the elections in August. So the 59% of the voters supported this initiative, and a lot of the discussion there was around connecting it to redistribution and saying, look, if we're going to lose 12% of total oil production, which is what Yasuni accounts for, more or less, then we need to think about redistribution in a different way. So I think it's connected to redistribution of wealth, income, land, water, and trying to really, I would argue, leverage this incredible environmental consciousness that's emerged in Ecuador over the last 20 or 30 years, which I think is expressed in the SME initiative, and thinking about a Green New Deal, or just transitions, or degrowth, or eco-socialism, or whatever it might be. That's what I would, that's where I would go. But of course, we come up against these massive challenges, that we've seen throughout the development of Latin America, ever since it was inserted into the capitalist economy in the 16th and 17th century. So I don't think any of this is easy, but I do think that Latin America is really inspirational in that sense, and has lots of incredible ideas and possibilities, even if when they're incorporated into state policy, they're often de-radicalized and watered down.
I want to give the last word, and therefore I'll ask a little question to Melany and to Anna, if I can. And that's that it seems to be very precarious, the government of Lula. And just by a very small margin, and if anything, things are moving since he came to power. And in Chile also, it seems to me that when we think about a right that is actually mobilizing against many of the ideas of the urban feminist movement, what are the chances that power can be used in Brazil and in Chile to consolidate a direction towards the left in the face of what we're witnessing elsewhere?
Yes, thank you. That's a very good question, and obviously there's a lot of factors to consider. But I think perhaps there's one positive element is that there are continued very strong social movements, and there's a strong left in Chile, a left that is not an old left, that is a new left, that is represented by the character of Gabriel Boric, and he still has decent popularity, let's put it that way, not good but decent. So that still exists, but you're right, there is a rise of the far right. My sense of Chile is that because we have the referendum on the 17th of December, where we're going to vote this new draft of the constitution, all the polls are indicating that the draft is going to fail again. So we will end up with the old constitution, or the current constitution. My guess is because the polarization of the political system is not fitting any ideas that the civil society are expressing. Nothing is actually changing. It's not changing much with the current government. And because of the short periods of governments we have in Chile, of only 4 years, it's unlikely that many things are going to change. I wouldn't be surprised if there is a switch into the far right in the next election, but at the same time, I don't think they will have long-term success unless they use old-fashioned tools like the military and authoritarianism in a more straightforward way, which I don't, it will be very surprising in the case of Chile, but not impossible, because nothing though these things are impossible. So I think those scenarios needs to be managed to understand the balance of power. If we just think about power as holding the power of the state, because as you well said just before, national elites continue to be the same, and they haven't changed with this progressive government, and the economic model has not shifted, in any other direction than neoliberal austerity, or maybe less austerity, but a continuation of neoliberalism.
Thank you. And Anna, the last word to you.
Okay. Oh, that's a very interesting and complex question. So I agree. I think the situation of Lula's government is very precarious in terms of political support. So what the working parties, some of the working party leaders are saying is that they will have to sacrifice some of its agenda, for instance, the environmental agenda.